Karoline Leavitt sat poised, her hands calmly folded on the desk. Her expression was unreadable, yet the sharpness in her eyes revealed she was prepared for battle. Facing her was Martin Wallace, a veteran political host known for his relentless questioning and, at times, aggressive tactics. Wallace had made a career out of putting conservatives in the hot seat, and tonight, Karoline was his target. But unlike the others who had crumbled under his rapid-fire interrogations, she wasn't here to be intimidated. The segment had started cordially enough, with standard questions about President Trump's latest policies and the administration's stance on national security. Karoline had countered every question with precision and clarity. But Wallace had a different plan. He leaned forward now, adjusting his tie as the camera zoomed in on his expectant face. "Let's talk about transparency, Ms. Leavitt," Wallace said, his voice carrying the practiced smoothness of a seasoned broadcaster. "The American people have a right to know the truth. Your administration has been accused of withholding critical information about foreign policy dealings. Isn't it fair to say that this White House is actively avoiding accountability?" Karoline tilted her head slightly, a small, knowing smile playing on her lips. She could already see the trap he was trying to set. He wasn't asking a question. He was framing a narrative. One designed to paint the administration as secretive and evasive, regardless of how she answered. She didn't rush. She let the silence linger, an old media trick she had learned from watching the best communicators. Let them overplay their hand. Let them fill the silence. Wallace raised an eyebrow, mistaking her patience for hesitation. "You're dodging the question, aren't you?" he pressed. "If you won't answer directly, what does that say about your administration's honesty?" Karoline exhaled softly, then met his gaze head-on. "Martin, let's be honest with each other," she began, her tone composed but firm. "You didn't invite me here for a fair discussion. You invited me for a spectacle. But I'll play along." Wallace's eyes flickered with slight surprise, but he recovered quickly. "I assure you, Ms. Leavitt, these are legitimate questions." "Questions," she interrupted smoothly, leaning forward slightly. "Or accusations disguised as journalism." The studio went still. Even the crew members behind the cameras exchanged glances. Wallace had been in this game long enough to recognize a shift in momentum when it happened. Karoline wasn't just answering, she was controlling the conversation now. Wallace, sensing the pressure, adjusted his approach. "So, are you denying that this administration has refused to release key documents related to foreign negotiations?" Karoline didn't blink. "Are you denying that the previous administration did the exact same thing without your network ever questioning them?" Wallace hesitated. Just for a second. But that second was all she needed. She pressed on. "Because if we're going to talk about transparency, let's talk about consistency. Where was this level of scrutiny when the previous administration refused to disclose the contents of private meetings with world leaders? Where was this urgency when classified documents were mishandled? If we're setting a standard, let's make sure it applies to everyone." Wallace tried to interject, but she wasn't finished. "The American people do deserve the truth. But they also deserve honesty from the media. If you want to ask hard-hitting questions, that's fine. But let's not pretend this is about fairness when it's selective outrage." A quiet murmur spread through the control room. The producers, who were monitoring viewer engagement in real time, saw something unexpected. The live audience was reacting positively to Karoline's composure. Wallace adjusted his papers, but Karoline could see it now, the faint crack in his confidence. He had underestimated her. "So, to answer your original question, Martin," she continued, her voice steady, "this administration has been and will continue to be transparent where it matters, protecting the American people, not playing into political theatrics." The seconds that followed felt like an eternity. Wallace was rarely left speechless, but the silence said it all. Karoline had turned the tables. The host cleared his throat. "Well, that's certainly a strong perspective, Ms. Leavitt." Karoline gave a slight nod. "I deal in facts, Martin, not narratives." The control room producer spoke into Wallace's earpiece, signaling him to move on. He had lost control of the interview. As they cut to commercial break, Karoline remained seated, her expression unchanged. But inside, she knew. She had just done something few had managed before. She had beaten Martin Wallace at his own game. As the commercial break began, Martin Wallace leaned back in his chair, rolling his shoulders as if trying to shake off the embarrassment of the last exchange. His eyes flickered toward Karoline Leavitt, who remained composed, her expression unreadable. He was used to grilling White House officials, making them squirm, forcing them into verbal missteps that would go viral. But tonight, he had been outmaneuvered. Behind the cameras, the producers scrambled, reviewing real-time audience reactions and engagement metrics. Something wasn't right. Usually, when Wallace put a high-profile guest on the defensive, viewers would flood social media with support. Not this time. Instead, Karoline's sharp responses, her calm but forceful demeanor, and her ability to throw Wallace's accusations right back at him were resonating with the audience. The segment was trending on social media, but not in Wallace's favor. A producer rushed over, whispering into his earpiece, "We need to shift the narrative. Bring up the administration's controversies. Hit her where it hurts." Wallace nodded. He wasn't done yet. The countdown to live resumed. 3, 2, 1. The network's theme music played, and they were back. Wallace adjusted his tie, forcing a smile as he turned toward the camera. "Welcome back to the program. We're speaking with White House Press Secretary Karoline Leavitt, discussing transparency, accountability, and this administration's policies." He turned to face Karoline again, his expression hardening. "Now, Karoline, while we're on the subject of accountability, let's talk about the administration's handling of recent intelligence reports regarding national security threats. The public has a right to know, has the White House been completely forthcoming about classified operations?" Karoline didn't flinch. She knew what he was trying to do. By throwing out vague references to intelligence reports and national security threats, he wasn't asking for facts. He was suggesting secrecy, corruption, and cover-ups without actually making a real accusation. "Are you referring to a specific intelligence report, Martin?" she asked, raising an eyebrow. Wallace hesitated. He hadn't expected her to challenge the premise of his question so quickly. "Well," he began, "there have been multiple concerns raised." Karoline leaned in slightly. "Concerns raised by whom? Your network? Unnamed sources? Or actual intelligence officials?" Wallace exhaled sharply. She was backing him into a corner. He glanced at his notes, pivoting. "The American people deserve honesty, Karoline. Do you deny that the administration has withheld information from the public?" She smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "You're asking me to prove a negative, Martin. You're implying wrongdoing without presenting any evidence. That's not journalism. That's speculation." Boom. Another blow landed. Wallace shifted in his chair. His frustration was growing, but he had one more card to play. "All right," he said, feigning an air of confidence. "Then let's address something specific. There have been reports suggesting that certain officials in the administration were involved in decisions that compromised national security. Are you saying those reports are false?" Karoline's expression didn't change. She let the silence stretch just long enough. Then, she delivered the finishing move. "Martin, let me ask you something. If I said there were reports suggesting that your network deliberately pushes misleading narratives, would you confirm or deny it?" Wallace's face froze. The tension in the room snapped like a wire pulled too tight. Karoline continued, her voice unwavering. "Because that's what you're doing here. You're throwing out accusations without evidence and demanding that I play defense against hypotheticals. That's not accountability. That's an ambush. And I won't play that game." The silence in the studio was deafening. Even the crew, who were supposed to remain neutral, looked stunned. Wallace opened his mouth, but no words came out. He had been outmaneuvered again. Karoline didn't break eye contact. She had turned the tables completely. And this time, there was no way for him to recover. The producer's voice came through Wallace's earpiece. "We need to cut early. Wrap it up." Wallace cleared his throat. "Well, that's all the time we have tonight." The camera zoomed in on Karoline one last time. Collected. Unshaken. And the audience knew exactly who had won this exchange. As the cameras cut off, the red live indicator flickering out, the studio fell into a stunned silence. Crew members behind the cameras exchanged glances. The producers in the control room were whispering frantically, trying to figure out how to spin what had just happened. Karoline Leavitt, however, remained unshaken. She adjusted her blazer, took a sip of water, and finally looked at Martin Wallace, who was still staring at his notes as if searching for a comeback that never arrived. He had lost. And worse, it was live on air for the entire country to see. Wallace exhaled sharply, offering a tight-lipped smile. "Well, Ms. Leavitt, that was certainly spirited. Thanks for coming on." Karoline smiled politely. "Always a pleasure, Martin." She stood gracefully, adjusting her posture before walking off the set. Even before she reached the exit, her phone started buzzing. Messages. Calls. A flood of reactions. Her team was already waiting for her in the green room. "You dominated that segment," one of her aides grinned, handing her a tablet with real-time analytics. Trending #1 on Twitter, #Leavitt crushes Wallace. Trending #2, #Media bias exposed. The reaction was overwhelmingly in her favor. Conservative commentators were praising her composure and strategic responses. Even moderate political analysts were calling her handling of the interview a masterclass in political messaging. But the real shock came from the liberal media. Several progressive outlets were forced to admit that Wallace had overplayed his hand, and that Karoline had exposed the double standards in media questioning. This was more than just a win, it was a statement. Back inside the studio, Martin Wallace was livid. He stormed into the control room, where his producers were already scrambling to contain the damage. "What the hell happened out there?" he snapped, running a hand through his hair. A junior producer hesitated. "Sir," the audience response, "it's not what we expected." Wallace scoffed. "Not what we expected. We were supposed to expose this administration's hypocrisy, not make her look like a damn hero. The executive producer stepped forward, her face tense. Martin, we need to be careful how we frame this post-show. If we go after her too hard now, it'll look like we're bitter. And the last thing we need is to feed into the exact narrative she just accused us of. Wallace clenched his jaw. He knew she was right. But he hated losing, especially on his own show. Karoline arrived back at the White House to a standing ovation from her team. Staffers, aides, even senior advisors were clapping. One of them, her deputy press secretary, grinned. I don't think I've ever seen Wallace get destroyed like that. You didn't just win the interview, you changed the entire media narrative. Karoline gave a small chuckle. Let's not get too comfortable. They'll come for us harder next time. Just then, her phone rang. Caller ID, President Trump. She stepped into her office before answering. Mr. President. Trump's voice came through, his tone unmistakably amused. Damn, Karoline. You just made my night. She smiled. Glad I could help, sir. Trump chuckled. You just did more damage to the mainstream media than I did in my last 3 rallies. We need to do this more often. Karoline smirked. I have a feeling they won't invite me back any time soon. Trump laughed. That's how you know you did it right. As the call ended, Karoline knew one thing for sure. She had just won a battle. But the war, that was just getting started. The next morning, Karoline's name was still trending. The full interview clip had millions of views online, and media outlets across the spectrum were forced to acknowledge her composure and sharp rebuttals. But Wallace and his team weren't going down without a fight. By midday, a new narrative had started to emerge. Some left-leaning outlets were now pushing the idea that Karoline had been rehearsed, that her responses were scripted, and that she had been trained to dodge real accountability. One prominent host on another network even claimed, Leavitt didn't win, she just avoided answering real questions. But the problem? Even their own audiences weren't buying it. Comment sections, call-ins, and even some progressive commentators were openly admitting that Wallace had set himself up for failure. And when polling data started coming in, it showed that independent voters, especially moderates, had responded positively to Karoline's handling of the interview. She hadn't just won over her base. She had won over undecideds. And that made her one of the most dangerous political figures in the media landscape. 3 days later, Martin Wallace made one last attempt to salvage his credibility. His show released an edited version of the interview, cutting out Karoline's strongest responses and making it appear as if she had dodged questions. It was a desperate move, but it backfired spectacularly. Within hours, the unedited, full-length version of the interview was circulating online, with thousands of users calling out the manipulation. The backlash was so intense that Wallace's network was forced to issue a statement clarifying that they had shortened the interview for time constraints. No one believed them, and Wallace's credibility took a hit that he would never fully recover from. Sitting in her White House office, Karoline watched it all unfold. She wasn't celebrating. She didn't need to. She had just sent a clear message. She wasn't just another press secretary. She was a force to be reckoned with. And the media, they wouldn't underestimate her again.